Despite all his grandfather's legendary successes, King Hain II inherited an impoverished kingdom, racked by war and angry vassals, which he had to deal with before they dealt with him. His grandfather may have saved himself this trouble by staying out on campaign, but King Hain II was decidedly unable to afford such a thing. The problems compounded for decades by kings dying young and the aristocracy swelling in power now lay at his feet, the first king to even attempt to fix this disastrous state of affairs. Meanwhile, by 1090, the crusade for Portugal was a success, carving out the Kingdom of Portugal from the Hussamids. Merely a year after his ascension, King Hain II was faced with a rebellion to lower crown authority and change the succession laws to gavelkind, spanning half the kingdom with nearly 4 times his levies of 34,000 men. King Hain II, realizing the threat this posed to the survival of the kingdom itself, raised his 10,000-man host and set off to preserve what his ancestors had worked so hard to build. His first maneuver of the war was to gather his troops in the south near Oxnaford and defeat the smallest rebel army. The crown won, and when a separate 14,000-man army gave chase, King Hain gathered 53 ships and, barely outrunning their army, sailed north, where they had neglected to station troops. The strategy that was employed here was to outrun the innumerable enemy army by way of luring them to the very ends of the kingdom, and then besieging the areas they left bare in order to once again give chase. This strategy would begin to turn the tide of war in 1095, when the Vannin army was able to not only escape the rebel forces near Cymru, but also besiege the castle of the rebel leader Artgal the Fat in Erigala, and capture his wife before leaving. By 1098, the war became more difficult, for the enemy had caught on to the tactics used by King Hain II. Artgal the Fat, splitting his forces to cut the response times of the invading forces of the king. King Hain II, upon realizing he had been found out, sailed south to minor French provinces which bordered the coast of Alençon, conquering them and establishing the base of power where the navyless rebel forces could not have gone. Despite his resolve and unmatched will, his entire reign spent in the midst of war fighting for his kingdom, on the 4th of December 1099, King Hain II died in battle against Lord Siamhair of Northumberland at the age of 38. His uncle Beitan Monad ascended to the throne at the age of 48. The kingdom of Nairn was inherited by Hain's only child, his daughter the 15-year-old Gormlaith, and thus became the queen of an independent kingdom. Days after the death of his nephew, King Beitan received a message from Lord Artgal the Fat with an offer of a white peace. Artgal having duly noted that for the good of the realm, the kingdom of Vannin must return to peace regardless of the crown authority. Perhaps it was the loss of Nairn that provoked the sudden change of heart in the rebel ranks, but King Beitan had no other choice but to accept. And so, by 1100, the Isles lay shattered once again, stewing in an uneasy peace. Such peace would be short-lived, as later that year another revolt to lower crown authority was begun by another, separate group of rebels who had been waiting for the kingdom to be weak in order to strike. Thankfully, they had only around 5,000 men, so they were not quite as much of a threat as the last revolt. They were defeated the next year. In 1106, King Beitan decided to strike against Nairn and her false queen. Queen Gormlaith the Lame, called so for her limp arm, led her 16,000-man army against the great Vannin host of 31,000 proud knights. It was fit to be a large and bloody war, but she died in her camp, killed by one of Vannin's highest generals, and so the false reign of Gormlaith was over, and Vannin was made whole once again. Meanwhile, on the continent, the year 1107 saw further steady consolidation both in the physical and metaphysical realms. Namely, Christianity had made further gains, while the forces of paganism seemed to have stalled. This could be partially explained by the success of recent crusades, as well as the general momentum that Christendom had managed to build up against the heathens that surrounded it. To begin the analysis of the new century, however, one must begin with Vannin. The Isles were undisputably Vannin's dominion, however there were some distinct holdouts like Essex and the Teutonic Order. Vannin itself, however, had been subject to a century of chaos and subterfuge amongst the highest halls of its court, and as a result the country suffered. Indeed, if a strong enough interloper sought a glorious conquest, he could doubtlessly find it in 12th century Vannin. However, the spirit of the age is perhaps best exemplified in Iberia, where Nefarious reunited and new players in the region such as Leon, Asturias, Portugal, and Occitania had joined in on the war against the Moors. The Fatimids were almost completely driven out, and the Hussamids were the final major Muslim presence in Europe. The Gallic region was worlds different than it was a mere 107 years prior. Alençon had swelled in size and taken up the title of France, laying claim to Charlemagne's ancient Francia. Aquitaine had also managed to conquer a great deal of minor dukes and counts, and growing strong in the face of weakened Nefarious, Aquitania founded the Empire of Occitania, promptly expanding into Iberia and even North Africa. Truly, the powers of that region would indeed soon come to blows. The Italian peninsula saw the strong get stronger, the Kingdom of Lombardia establishing the empire thereof and conquering part of North Africa, Venetia snaking its way further south and increasing its wealth, Benevento conquering parts of North Africa in its own right and getting in the way of Phoenician hegemony, and the Papal State bringing its neighbors into line with Rome. The Germanic region, by contrast, hadn't changed very much, save for the fact that Polska had conquered much of the Pulzen League, and France had made inroads there. The north was somewhat more organized, with the Empire of Denmark seeking successful conquests against their northern brothers, and Livima lording over much of the Baltic Sea. Indeed, one of the most notable changes was Noruega losing its place of power in the region. Eastern Europe was still wild, yet certain tribes were carving out more distinct realms for themselves, namely the Tuva, Vladimir, and Sukhov. The Bilar, once a dominating horde in the region, had been beaten back on all fronts, but especially by the Odyssey Federation. The Balkans was still a place of power, but no longer one of empire. The Magyar had lost the direct and purposeful sponsorship of the Orthodox Church, seeing that the Odyssey Federation had totally converted, as well as nearly the entirety of the region including Anatolia. Speaking of which, the Odyssey Federation was ascendant, strengthening its position in the face of the Magyar fall from empire. To the south, the eastern Mediterranean was still characterized by disunity. The Attica League had shrunk back to a scant few cities, while the South Slavic kingdom of Megale came pouring down into Greece. Such pressures resulted in Greeks striking out into places far afield, including Lakandu, which conquered the Holy Land from the Gibralid. The Orthodox control of the Holy Land was a major boon for the religion, and bolstered the strength of its theological claims against the Catholics. North Africa was beginning to be chipped away at by several Italian powers, namely Benevento, Neapolis, Lombardia, Urbino, and even the Papal State. The Maghreb was thus swept aside, treated as an extension of European power, and not as its own region. The Middle East, meanwhile, never got around to administering North Africa, as they were much too busy fighting each other. Though Taharian still existed to the north, Khorasan to the south, and Dulafian endeavored to control the Caspian Sea, but the presence and immediate success of non-Muslims like the Orthodox Christian Greeks of Lakandu or the Theravada Buddhist Kurds of Kabulistan was a distinct wake-up call for the Sunni powers that called that place home. In the years after the war, King Beitan changed his ambitions from those of war to those of stewardship, as it became plainly obvious to him that the kingdom was in need of serious rebuilding. He endeavored to have good relations with his vassals and to breathe new life into Vannin itself. However, shortly after striking a delicate balance between the crown and the nobility on the 14th of September 1112, King Beitan of Vannin died of health complications due to wry mouth at the age of 60. By the time of his death, he had restored much of the empty coffers, built a grand hedge maze for the capital, reclaimed the West Riding from the Teutonic Order, and personally understood the complaints of his vassals who came to love him. His 10-year-old son, King Alistair, ascended to the throne of Vannin, but unlike so many kings before him, he ascended into peace and order and was given a good regent to ensure the young king was healthy and well cared for. Indeed, while things were somewhat uncertain after his death, King Beitan played his part, and people could hope that the Black Dragon had finally found its footing once again.